Imagine pitching this to investors today. We're going to start a spice trading company. Our business model? Sail to the other side of the world, buy goods at gunpoint, create a monopoly through violence, tax 400 million people without representation, and occasionally commit genocide when quarterly earnings look weak. Oh, and we'll need our own army and navy and the legal right to wage war and execute people. Also, we'll pay ourselves dividends even when we're bankrupt. You'd be laughed out of every boardroom in Silicon Valley and possibly arrested. But on December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I thought this was such a brilliant idea that she gave one group of merchants exactly these powers. She handed them a royal charter that was essentially a license to commit corporate warfare. The British East India Company was born, and with it, the template for every morally questionable corporation that followed. This isn't a story about trade. It's a story about what happens when you give a corporation the powers of a nation-state and the accountability of a lemonade stand. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll follow the money trail of an organization that transformed from a scrappy trading startup into a military empire, then back into bankruptcy while paying dividends the entire time. It's a masterclass in creative accounting, regulatory capture, and why giving corporations their own armies is a spectacularly bad idea. This is the story of the world's first megacorporation, the first company too big to fail, the first corporate bailout, the first stock market bubble, and the first example of privatized colonialism. The British East India Company didn't just bend the rules of capitalism, they wrote them, and we're still living with the consequences.
Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are insane from day one. In 1600, 218 merchants and noblemen pooled together 68,373 pounds, roughly $12 million in today's money, to create the Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Catchy name. For that investment, Queen Elizabeth I granted them a 15-year monopoly on all English trade with Asia. Not trade rights, not preferred status, complete monopoly. Think about that deal structure. A private company gets exclusive rights to trade with literally half the world's population. Imagine if Amazon got a government-enforced monopoly on all e-commerce. That's essentially what happened. But here's where it gets really cute. The charter gave them the right to make war or peace with any non-Christian power. Read that again. A corporation, a business whose purpose was generating returns for shareholders, was given the legal authority to wage war. It's as if Exxon could declare war on Venezuela if oil negotiations went poorly, or if Walmart could invade Canada for better lumber prices. This wasn't trade policy, it was outsourced imperialism with a profit motive. The early investors were a who's who of Elizabethan society, merchants, nobles, and courtiers who understood they weren't just buying into a shipping company, they were buying into a legally sanctioned protection racket with global reach. The initial business plan was simple. Sail to the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, buy spices, particularly pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, and sell them in Europe at a 300 to 500% markup. Spices were literally worth more than gold by weight. A successful voyage could generate returns of 500% or more. That's the kind of ROI that makes crypto bros weep with envy. Now let's talk about the organizational chart, because it's bonkers. The company was governed by a court of directors, 24 men elected by shareholders led by a governor. Very democratic, very modern. except shareholders were exclusively wealthy men who could afford shares priced at £50 each, about $8,000 today. So really, it was an oligarchy with good branding. Directors served one-year terms but could be re-elected indefinitely. Several directors served for decades, creating a permanent corporate aristocracy. The governor of the company often wielded more practical power than members of parliament. Some served both roles simultaneously, which is what we in the modern era call a massive conflict of interest. Here's the brilliant part. The company raised capital through joint stock offerings for individual voyages. Investors would buy into a specific expedition, and when the ships returned, profits would be distributed and the joint stock would dissolve. It was like a really violent IPO that happened every few years. This structure meant the company could lose an entire fleet to storms or warfare without bankrupting the whole enterprise. Risk was distributed across multiple ventures. Brilliant financial engineering, and a model that allowed them to be reckless with other people's money while directors drew salaries regardless of outcomes. By 1657, they transitioned to a permanent joint stock structure, creating what we'd recognize as a modern corporation with tradable shares. Congratulations, the company just invented the stock market bubble. We'll see how that goes later. The company's first voyage departed in 1601 with 5 ships. 2 years later, the survivors returned with holds full of pepper. The voyage generated a 95% profit. Not bad. Subsequent voyages were even more profitable when they went well, and catastrophic when they didn't. The company was essentially a high-stakes gambling operation where the odds were determined by weather, navigation, disease, and whether you could successfully threaten or bribe local rulers. Early on, the company faced stiff competition from the Dutch East India Company, VOC, which was even more ruthless and better capitalized. The Dutch had a head start and weren't shy about using violence to maintain their monopoly. In 1623, Dutch forces tortured and executed 10 English traders on the island of Amboina in what became known as the Amboina Massacre. The English response? They pivoted. If the Dutch controlled the Spice Islands, the English would focus on India. This wasn't strategy, it was the corporate equivalent of, fine, we didn't want those spices anyway. India was a consolation prize. It was also the decision that would transform a trading company into an imperial power that controlled 1/5 of the global population. Sometimes losing is winning. Sometimes getting kicked out of Indonesia means you accidentally conquer India. The company was about to teach the world that there's no problem that can't be solved with a combination of monopoly power, military force, and creative accounting. Let's set the scene. In the early 1600s, India wasn't a unified country. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, sultanates, and the declining Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire under Jahangir was still wealthy and powerful, but regional governors, called Nawabs, were increasingly independent. For the company, this was perfect. Political fragmentation meant they could play different powers against each other. Think of it as entering a market with lots of competitors and no dominant player, a corporate dream. The company's early strategy in India was actually legitimate trade. They established factories, or trading posts, in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They bought cotton textiles, silk, indigo, saltpeter, and tea. They paid for these goods with silver, mostly Spanish silver from South America, ironically. The trade was profitable and relatively peaceful. Indian textiles were superior to anything produced in Europe. Indian cotton was softer, dyes were more vibrant, and craftsmanship was unmatched. The company was making money hand over fist just buying Indian goods and selling them in Europe. But here's the thing about corporations. Enough is never enough. Why pay for goods when you could take them? Why negotiate when you could dictate terms? Why be a customer when you could be the owner? The transformation from trading company to military power happened gradually, then suddenly. In 1686, the company decided to flex its military muscle and declared war on the Mughal Empire. Yes, a corporation declared war on one of the world's great empires. This went about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, terribly. The Mughals crushed them, blockaded their trading posts, and forced the company to pay reparations and literally beg for forgiveness. You'd think this would teach them humility. Instead, they learned they needed a bigger army. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, the company slowly militarized. They recruited Indian soldiers, called sepoys, to guard their trading posts. Then they recruited more to protect their supply lines. Then more to defend against French competition. Then more because, well, they had an army, so why not use it? By 1550, the company had approximately 3,000 European soldiers and 6,000 sepoys. By 1763, they had 26,000 European soldiers and 90,000 sepoys. By 1800, their army was 200,000 strong, larger than the British Army itself. Let me put this in perspective. A private corporation controlled an army larger than most nation-states. It's as if Apple decided its security personnel should include 200,000 troops with artillery and cavalry. It's as if Goldman Sachs had its own navy. The company had stopped being a business and become a military contractor that occasionally sold tea. June 23, 1757. The date the British East India Company transitioned from troublesome merchant to imperial overlord. The Battle of Plassey wasn't really a battle, it was a hostile corporate takeover with bayonets. Here's what happened. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had the audacity to expect them to follow local laws and pay taxes. Unacceptable. The company was used to operating in a legal gray zone where rules were suggestions. So, they decided to replace him. Not through democratic process or legal challenge, through military force and bribery. Robert Clive, the company's military commander in India, assembled an army of 3,000 men, mostly sepoys, and marched against the Nawab's force of 50,000. On paper, this was suicide. In practice, it was brilliant corruption. Clive had secretly bribed Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's key commanders, promising him the throne if he betrayed his leader. Mir Jafar agreed. When battle commenced, Mir Jafar's forces stood aside while Clive's smaller force destroyed the Nawab's army. The battle lasted less than a day. Casualties for the company? 23. Casualties for the Nawab? Thousands. The payoff? The company installed Mir Jafar as the new Nawab, a puppet ruler who owed his position entirely to them. And they demanded compensation for their trouble, 22.5 million rupees, roughly $400 million today, plus the zamindari, tax collection rights, for lands surrounding Calcutta. Think about that. A corporation just overthrew a government and then charged that government for the privilege. Robert Clive personally received £234,000 from the new Nawab, about $42 million today. When later questioned in Parliament about whether he'd taken too much, Clive famously replied, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." That's not just bold, that's sociopathic levels of entitlement. The Battle of Plassey was just the beginning. In 1765, the company pulled off perhaps the greatest accounting trick in history. The Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, weakened and desperate, granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, the right to collect taxes from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. These provinces contained approximately 30 million people and were among the richest regions in India. Let's be clear about what this means. A private corporation was given the legal authority to tax tens of millions of people. They could collect revenue but had no obligation to provide governance, infrastructure, or protection. It was taxation without representation on a scale that would have made King George III blush. The numbers are staggering. Annual revenue from Bengal alone was approximately £3 million, roughly $540 million in today's money. This was more than the entire annual revenue of the British government at the time. A corporation was collecting more tax revenue than the actual British government. The company now had three revenue streams: trade profits, tax collection, and land rents. They were simultaneously a business, a government, and a landlord. It's as if Amazon became the IRS while also owning half the real estate in America. And here's the beautiful part from their perspective. This revenue was technically private corporate income, not British government revenue. So while the British state was going into debt fighting wars in America and Europe, a British corporation was sitting on a mountain of tax money with minimal oversight. The company had achieved peak capitalism. They'd privatized profit while socializing risk. They'd created a system where they collected taxes but didn't provide services, made laws but weren't subject to them, and wielded state power without state accountability. What could possibly go wrong? Let's talk about the Bengal famine of 1770 because it perfectly illustrates what happens when you let a corporation optimize for quarterly earnings rather than, keeping people alive. Bengal had experienced famines before. They were part of the monsoon cycle. But what happened between 1769 and 1773 was different. This famine killed approximately 10 million people, 1/3 of Bengal's population. To put that in perspective, it would be like 100 million Americans dying over 4 years. And it was entirely preventable. Here's what the company did wrong in roughly chronological order. First, they raised taxes. In 1765, when they acquired the Diwani, land taxes in Bengal were already high. The company immediately raised them by 10%, then another 10%, then another. By 1770, taxes had increased by more than 60%. Farmers who couldn't pay had their land seized. The company was optimizing for revenue extraction without considering that people need to, eat. Second, they diverted agriculture toward cash crops. The company pressured farmers to grow indigo, opium, and cotton, export crops that could be sold in international markets rather than food crops. Makes sense from a profit perspective, catastrophic from a keeping humans alive perspective. Third, when the drought hit in 1769, the company did nothing. They didn't reduce taxes, they didn't open emergency grain stores, they didn't allow free movement of food from surplus areas to deficit areas. Instead, they continued collecting taxes at bayonet point from starving farmers. Fourth, and this is where it gets truly evil, the company actually increased taxes during the famine. Their logic? Fewer people means the same revenue must come from fewer payers, so taxes must go up. It's economically logical and morally monstrous. Company officials wrote letters back to London describing bodies piling up in the streets, villages entirely depopulated, and survivors resorting to cannibalism. The response from the court of directors? A reminder that profit targets must be met. When the famine finally ended in 1773, Bengal's population had been reduced by 1/3, agricultural production had collapsed, and the company's revenue had increased. They'd collected more tax during the famine than before it. Wall Street would have given them a bonus for hitting targets in a challenging market environment. Now, you might be wondering, if the company controlled such wealthy territories and collected so much tax revenue, why were they always broke? Great question. The answer is corruption, military spending, and dividends, roughly in that order. Let's start with corruption. Company officials in India were paid modest salaries, maybe £500 per year for a mid-level administrator. But they were expected to supplement this through private trade and gifts from local rulers. In practice, this meant every company employee was running side businesses, taking bribes, and embezzling funds. Robert Clive made nearly £500,000 during his time in India, about $90 million today, on an official salary that couldn't have totaled more than £10,000. Where did the rest come from? Private trade, smuggling, gifts, bribes, and administrative fees, theft. This pattern repeated at every level. Company officials became fabulously wealthy, while the company itself remained perpetually cash poor. It's the same dynamic you see in failed states. The organization is broke, but everyone running it is rich. Then there's military spending. Maintaining an army of 200,000 men wasn't cheap. Military expenses consumed roughly 50 to 60% of the company's Indian revenues. They were spending millions to conquer more territory, which required more military spending, which required conquering more territory to pay for it. It's imperialism as a Ponzi scheme. But here's my favorite part: the dividends. Throughout the 1760s and 1770s, even as the company was running deficits and couldn't pay its bills in India, they continued paying dividends to shareholders in London. In some years, dividends exceeded actual profits. They were literally borrowing money to pay dividends, the corporate equivalent of taking out a payday loan to buy lottery tickets. Why? Because the company's share price depended on maintaining dividend payments, and many directors were major shareholders, and directors' compensation was partly in company stock. So they had a personal incentive to keep dividends flowing, even if it bankrupted the company. This is what accountants call aggressive dividend policy, and what normal humans call looting. By 1772, the company was technically insolvent. They'd borrowed £1.5 million from the Bank of England, about $270 million today, owed another £1 million to other creditors, and couldn't make payroll for their Indian army. But they were still paying a double-digit annual dividend. Let me say that again. They were bankrupt, but paying double-digit dividends. It's beautiful in a sociopathic sort of way. In 1773, the British East India Company did what every failing mega-corporation eventually does. They went to the government with their hand out. The ask was £1.4 million, about $250 million today, to avoid immediate bankruptcy. The threat was clear. If the company failed, thousands of British investors would be wiped out, trade with Asia would collapse, and Britain would lose its foothold in India. The company was, in the parlance of our time, too big to fail. Parliament had a decision to make. They could let the company collapse and face economic catastrophe, Or they could bail them out and establish the precedent that sufficiently large private entities could privatize profits while socializing losses. You can probably guess what happened. Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in American colonies and a massive loan to keep them afloat. This was supposed to solve their cash flow problems by opening a new market. Instead, it triggered the Boston Tea Party and helped spark the American Revolution. In a beautiful twist of irony, the company's bailout contributed to Britain losing its most valuable colonies. It's almost poetic. But the bailout itself is the important precedent. For the first time in history, a government had explicitly guaranteed a private corporation's debts because the corporation was too economically and politically important to fail. The 2008 financial crisis didn't invent too big to fail. The British East India Company pioneered it in 1773. The bailout came with strings attached. The Regulating Act of 1773, which imposed some government oversight. The company now had to report to Parliament. The Governor-General of India would be appointed by the Crown, and there were vague promises of better governments. In practice, this meant the company now had government backing without significant government control. They'd achieved the ultimate corporate fantasy: privatized profits, socialized risks, and minimal accountability. The company had taught the world a valuable lesson. If you make yourself indispensable and threaten enough economic damage, you can get taxpayers to cover your losses while you keep the profits. It's a lesson corporations have never forgotten. After the Bengal disaster and the bailout, you'd think the company would maybe reconsider their business model. Instead, they discovered an even more profitable scheme: drug trafficking. Here's the problem they faced. British consumers were becoming obsessed with tea. Tea consumption in Britain increased from virtually nothing in 1700 to over £2 million annually by 1750, to over £20 million by 1800. Tea was transforming from a luxury into a necessity, and virtually all tea came from China. The Chinese had a simple trade policy. They'd happily sell tea to European merchants, but they wanted payment in silver. Not goods, not credit, silver bullion. The Chinese Empire was completely self-sufficient and saw nothing of value in European products. It was the ultimate trade imbalance. For every £3 million worth of tea the company bought, they had to ship £3 million in silver to China. This was economically unsustainable. Britain didn't produce silver. They had to buy it from Spanish America, which meant silver was flowing from South America to Britain to China in an endless, expensive cycle. The company needed a product the Chinese would accept instead of silver, something the Chinese market wanted, something valuable enough to balance the tea trade. They found it: opium. Let's admire the beautiful simplicity of the opium trade, because from a pure business perspective, it's a masterpiece of vertical integration and market creation. Here's how the triangle worked. Step 1. The company controlled Bengal, where the best opium poppies grew. They forced Bengali farmers to grow opium instead of food crops, buying it at fixed prices. The company had a production monopoly. Step 2. The company sold this opium at auction in Calcutta to private merchants, often company officials working their side businesses. These merchants smuggled it into China, where opium was illegal. Step 3. The merchants sold opium in China for silver, then used that silver to buy tea from legal Chinese merchants. Step 4. The tea was shipped to Britain and sold to the company, which sold it to British consumers. Result: the company paid for tea with opium instead of silver. The trade deficit disappeared. Profits soared. It's brilliant triangular arbitrage. It's also creating millions of drug addicts to solve an accounting problem. By 1830, the company was exporting over 30,000 chests of opium annually, each chest containing about 140 pounds of opium. That's over 4 million pounds of opium being smuggled into China every year. By 1839, it was nearly 40,000 chests. The social impact in China was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that by 1835, roughly 2 million Chinese were addicted to opium, about 1% of the population. In coastal provinces, the addiction rate reached 10% or higher. Entire towns had opium dens on every corner. The Chinese government repeatedly demanded the British stop the trade. The British government's response was essentially, "It's not us, it's a private company." The company's response was, "Technically, we only sell it in Calcutta. What happens after that isn't our responsibility." It's the drug dealer's defense. "I'm just a businessman. What customers do with the product isn't my fault." In 1839, the Chinese government finally had enough. The Daoguang Emperor appointed Lin Zexu as High Commissioner to end the opium trade. Lin went nuclear. He confiscated and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium worth over 2 million pounds, about $360 million today, imprisoned British merchants, and blockaded British factories in Canton. The company's response? "This is an outrage. They destroyed our illegal drugs that we were smuggling into their country in violation of their laws. We demand compensation and the right to continue illegal drug trafficking." Parliament agreed. In 1840, Britain declared war on China to force them to accept opium imports. Yes, you read that correctly. Britain went to war with China to force them to allow British drug trafficking. It wasn't framed that way, of course. The official justification was free trade and protecting British merchants and seeking compensation for destroyed property. But everyone knew what it was really about: opium money. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was hilariously one-sided. British steam-powered warships demolished Chinese junks. British rifled muskets outranged Chinese matchlocks. It wasn't a war, it was a beating. China sued for peace and signed the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. Terms: China pays 21 million pounds in reparations, about $3.8 billion today. Hong Kong ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 Chinese ports opened to British trade. British citizens in China subject only to British law, extraterritoriality. And, crucially, nothing about opium. It remained technically illegal, but effectively unrestricted. It's the greatest drug dealer victory in history. Britain had literally waged war to keep China addicted to opium. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, was even more one-sided. This time, Britain demanded that opium be legalized. China capitulated. By treaty, China was forced to legalize opium imports and accept foreign drug dealers. Imagine if the Mexican cartels had their own army, invaded the United States, and forced the U.S. government to legalize cocaine imports and pay them reparations. That's essentially what happened. The opium trade peaked in the 1880s at over 80,000 chests annually. The social damage was incalculable. The Chinese government would spend the next century trying to eliminate opium addiction. But the British East India Company? They'd found the perfect product. Infinitely repeatable revenue from addicted customers, backed by military force when necessary. It's capitalism without ethics, trade without morals, and profit maximization taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. By the 1850s, the company had been ruling India for nearly a century. They'd become complacent, arrogant, and sloppy, classic signs of an organization that's gotten too big and too comfortable. The spark that lit the fire was, absurdly, beef and pork fat. The company introduced new Enfield rifles to their Indian sepoys. These rifles used paper cartridges that soldiers had to bite open before loading. Rumors spread that the cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The company's response to these concerns was essentially, "Stop being so sensitive." This went over about as well as you'd expect. On May 10, 1857, sepoys in Meerut mutinied, killed their British officers, and marched to Delhi. Within weeks, the rebellion spread across northern India. Soldiers who'd been the backbone of company rule turned against their employers with extreme prejudice. The Sepoy Mutiny, or Indian Rebellion of 1857, depending on your perspective, was brutal. Atrocities were committed by both sides. Cities were besieged. Massacres occurred. The company's administration in large parts of India completely collapsed. Here's the financial angle. The company had built their entire Indian operation on the assumption that sepoys would remain loyal. They'd spent 150 years creating an army of Indians commanded by a handful of British officers, paying them poorly, treating them as second-class soldiers, and expecting them to risk their lives protecting company interests. It's the same mistake every corporation makes, assuming your underpaid, overworked, undervalued employees will remain loyal forever, because why would they leave? The company had to request British Army reinforcements to suppress the rebellion. It took over a year and cost thousands of British and Indian lives. The financial cost was enormous, both in military expenses and lost revenue from territories where company authority had collapsed. When the dust settled in 1858, the company survived, but everyone, British government, investors, Indian subjects, and international observers agreed on one thing: the company was no longer fit to rule. The Government of India Act of 1858 was the death certificate for the British East India Company. After 258 years, the company was dissolved as a governing entity. All of its territories, armies, and responsibilities were transferred to the British Crown. This is often framed as a moral awakening, the British government finally taking responsibility for India after the company's misrule caused a massive rebellion. But let's look at the numbers, because the reality is more cynical. By 1858, the company was effectively bankrupt again. The Sepoy Mutiny had cost millions of pounds. They had massive debts to the British government. Their stock price had cratered. Shareholders were facing complete wipeout. The nationalization was actually a bailout in disguise. The British government assumed all company debts, paid shareholders £3 million in compensation, and took over all assets. Shareholders were made whole at taxpayer expense. So the company's shareholders, who had profited from decades of extraction, exploitation, and violence, were made whole. They lost nothing. Meanwhile, the British taxpayers and Indian subjects bore the costs. It's the ultimate privatization of profit and socialization of loss. The company extracted wealth for 250 years, and when they finally collapsed, taxpayers covered the bill while investors walked away whole. The company continued to exist as a legal entity managing tea and spice trade until 1874, when it was finally dissolved entirely. But by then, it was a zombie corporation, legally alive but functionally dead. Let's tally up what the British East India Company accomplished in its 274-year existence, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Territory controlled. At its peak, the company directly or indirectly controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, approximately 1.8 million square miles, containing over 200 million people. For comparison, that's roughly 60% of the land area of the continental United States. Revenue extracted. Between 1757 and 1857, the company extracted an estimated £1 billion from India, roughly $180 billion in today's money. But that doesn't account for destroyed industries, suppressed wages, and prevented development. Economic historians estimate the total drain on Indian wealth at closer to $45 trillion over the colonial period, when accounting for lost growth and compound interest. Famines. The company's rule saw at least a dozen major famines, killing tens of millions. The Bengal famine of 1770, the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, and numerous smaller famines were either caused or exacerbated by company policies prioritizing export crops over food security. Deindustrialization. When the company arrived, India produced approximately 25% of global manufacturing output. By the time they left, it was under 2%. The company systematically destroyed Indian textile manufacturing to protect British mills. Indian weavers had their thumbs cut off. Textile towns were depopulated. A global manufacturing powerhouse was transformed into a raw material supplier. Deaths. Total deaths directly attributable to company policies through famine, military action, and systematic exploitation is estimated at somewhere between 10 and 30 million people. The uncertainty in that number should tell you something about how little the company cared about tracking the human cost of their operations. Cultural destruction. The company looted temples, palaces, and cultural sites across India. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, now in the British Crown Jewels, was taken by the company. Countless artworks, manuscripts, and cultural treasures were stolen and sold to European collectors or destroyed. Opium addicts created. The company's opium trade created an estimated 15 to 20 million opium addicts in China, destroying countless families and communities. The social damage lasted generations. Return to shareholders. Over its lifetime, the company paid out hundreds of millions in dividends to shareholders. Many of Britain's great fortunes and many of its stately homes were built on company profits. The British East India Company was a case study in what happens when you prioritize shareholder value above all else, give a corporation sovereign powers, and eliminate accountability. They proved that a corporation, given sufficient power and insufficient oversight, will optimize for short-term profit even if it destroys long-term value. They'll extract rather than build, exploit rather than develop, and prioritize dividends over human life. It's a lesson we keep forgetting and keep paying for.
The British East India Company wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a blueprint that corporations have been following ever since. The playbook they established: secure monopoly power through government charter, use that monopoly to eliminate competition, vertically integrate to control supply chains, lobby government for favorable regulations, privatize profits while socializing risks. When threatened with failure, claim you're too big to fail. Use corporate structure to diffuse responsibility. Pay executives regardless of performance. Externalize all costs onto society. When caught, claim you were just following orders or maximizing shareholder value. Sound familiar? It should. The East India Company established the template for corporate misbehavior that we see today. Pharmaceutical companies buying legislation, tech monopolies crushing competition, defense contractors profiting from endless wars, financial institutions gambling with depositor money knowing they'll be bailed out. The company proved that if you make yourself sufficiently powerful and economically important, you can operate outside normal rules. You can lobby for laws that benefit you, break laws with impunity, destroy lives in pursuit of profit, and when consequences finally arrive, taxpayers will cover your losses while you keep your gains. Every corporate scandal since, Enron, Lehman Brothers, Wells Fargo, Purdue Pharma, follows the same basic pattern the company pioneered: privatize gains, socialize losses, and use complexity and corporate structure to avoid individual accountability. Here's the darkest joke: the British East India Company still exists. In 2005, an Indian entrepreneur bought the trademark and intellectual property rights to the East India Company name. Today, there's a luxury goods company operating under that brand, selling premium teas, coffees, and gourmet foods from a boutique shop in London. Their marketing leans heavily on the heritage and history of the East India Company name. They sell it as prestige, as tradition, as British excellence. The website features elegant packaging and talks about centuries of expertise in sourcing the finest goods from around the world. What they don't mention is that this expertise involved military conquest, systematic exploitation, and millions of deaths. It's like if someone started a luxury brand called the Belgian Congo Company and marketed it as sophisticated without mentioning the atrocities. But that's exactly the point. We've sanitized the company's legacy. We've turned robbery into trade, conquest into administration, and extraction into development. We've made the company's crimes so abstract, so historical, so distant that they can be rebranded as heritage. It's the ultimate victory. Your crimes become someone else's luxury brand. Let's end with the fundamental irony at the heart of the company's story. The British East India Company existed for 274 years,
They controlled the richest territories on Earth. They had monopoly power, military might, and government backing. They extracted trillions in wealth. They paid dividends for over 2 centuries. And yet, they went bankrupt, repeatedly. They needed government bailouts, multiple times. They couldn't actually sustain themselves despite having literally everything in their favor. Why? Because extraction isn't wealth creation. Taking isn't earning. Monopoly isn't innovation. Violence isn't value. The company confused cash flow with prosperity, just like Spain before them. They saw money coming in and assumed they were wealthy. But real wealth is productive capacity, the ability to create value, to innovate, to build. The company never built anything. They took what others built and shipped it elsewhere. India was wealthy before the company arrived. It had sophisticated manufacturing, thriving agriculture, advanced textiles, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. The company didn't create any of that. They simply extracted it, sold it, and called themselves successful. When you build your fortune on extraction rather than creation, on violence rather than value, on monopoly rather than innovation, you haven't actually created wealth, you've just stolen it. And stolen wealth doesn't last. The British East India Company proved that you can control 500 million people, extract trillions in resources, operate for nearly 3 centuries, and still end up bankrupt if your business model is fundamentally parasitic. They were the richest corporation in history, and they had nothing to show for it but a trail of corpses, a pile of unpaid debts, and a luxury tea brand with no sense of irony. So, what's the final balance sheet on the British East India Company? Assets? Approximately 0. Everything was seized by the British government in 1858, and shareholders were compensated at taxpayer expense. Liabilities? Tens of millions of lives destroyed, entire economies deindustrialized, societies destabilized, cultures plundered, a legacy of exploitation that poisoned international relations for centuries. Shareholder returns? Excellent, especially if you sold before the collapse. Many British fortunes were built on company dividends. Return on investment for society? Catastrophically negative. The company extracted wealth from productive economies and transferred it to a parasitic corporate structure that consumed resources without creating sustainable value. Legacy? The blueprint for every corporate atrocity that followed. The proof that corporations, given sufficient power and insufficient accountability, will optimize for profit at literally any cost. The British East India Company taught the world several crucial lessons. Never give corporations sovereign powers. Monopolies destroy value even while appearing profitable. Short-term extraction kills long-term prosperity. When the only tool you have is violence, every problem looks like something you can shoot. Paying dividends while insolvent is fraud, even if it's legal. Too big to fail means too big to exist. Corporate structure is a tool for avoiding individual responsibility. And most importantly, you can be rich and bankrupt at the same time if your wealth is stolen rather than created. The sun finally set on the British East India Company in 1874, but its shadow stretches across centuries, visible in every corporate scandal, every bailout, every time we're told that what's good for the corporation is good for society. The company that bought the world couldn't afford to keep it. They proved that conquest is expensive, exploitation is unsustainable, and you can drown in money while dying of thirst. They found unlimited wealth and it destroyed them. They conquered the richest lands on earth and went bankrupt. They controlled more people than any corporation before or since, and they couldn't keep the lights on. The British East India Company was the world's first mega-corporation, the first too big to fail, the first corporate empire. and they failed anyway. The ledger books tell the story, and the numbers never lie. Oh, and one final detail. When the British government took India from the company in 1858, they kept the exact same exploitative systems in place. Same tax structure, same forced labor, same cash crop agriculture, same deindustrialization policies. They just removed company from the letterhead and added British Empire. Because apparently, the only thing worse than being exploited by a corporation is being exploited by a government that learned all its tricks from that corporation. The British East India Company didn't just steal India's wealth, it taught the British government how to do it more efficiently. That's not a legacy, that's a masterclass in institutional evil. And the really terrifying part? We're still taking notes.